Hey guys, Crochet and Canuck here. I am coming to you today with a bit of a book review. You may remember this book that I showed in a video early this year because I received it as a Christmas gift from a friend. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about this book. I hadn't read it back then when I first showed it, but I just finished reading it now, and it was actually really interesting, full of some good information. But this is not a pattern book. I want to make that very clear. There are no sweater patterns in here. I know the cover might make it seem like there is, but there are no patterns in this book. This is all completely a technical book. It starts off with a little history of knitted fashions, vintage knitted fashions from the early 1900s and up until about 1960, and how knitted fashions evolved throughout those decades. And then it goes into where to find vintage patterns, how to read them, how to refit them to fit your body, because women's bodies back decades ago were different. They wore different undergarments to shape their bodies differently. So, and women were generally more petite and slender back then, so it tells you how to resize various parts of vintage sweaters without losing that vintage look. And how to resize them without ruining the various stitch patterns or color work on them. And it goes into how to calculate the gauge or the size of the actual garment, because some patterns from back then are very vague and don't really give sizes or gauges. So it explains how to figure all that out. It explains how to decide what kind of yarn you should use, because a lot of those patterns use a lot of now discontinued yarns, and a lot of the patterns didn't really give much explanation about the yarns as to like the size or the weight or the fiber makeup of the yarns. So it gives you some tips on how to try to decipher that from clues in the pattern. And it also goes into the popular color palettes of each decade. So if you really want to stick to the colors from those decades, then it tells you how to go about finding those colors and what those colors are. And so that's the first half of the book. It explains how to make vintage patterns fit you and how to actually go about using the patterns, because they're not written the same as they are now, and they use discontinued materials and that kind of thing. So the first half of the book explains how to use vintage patterns, and this is all for sweaters, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. This is all vintage sweater patterns. So the first half of the book is how to use vintage patterns. The second half of the book explains how to add vintage touches to modern sweater patterns. So you can do things like add vintage sleeves or necklines or pockets or cuffs to give it a little bit of a vintage look. You can add vintage buttons, and it shows how to knit and crochet buttons, or to cover buttons with knitting and crochet to make them look vintage, and how to source actual vintage buttons. There's things like edges and trims and making knitted shoulder pads and things like that to make modern sweaters look vintage. So that's basically what this book is about. It's just a technical workshop on how to make vintage patterns work for you, and how to make modern patterns with a vintage touch. So yeah, that's basically it. I don't know how much use I'm actually going to get out of this book, but it was an interesting read. I guess a lot of the tips and tricks could also be used for crochet sweater patterns, especially the ones in the second half of the book where it explains how to add vintage touches to modern patterns. I guess because the book actually has some knitting patterns for some vintage sleeves and collars and stuff. So I guess if you're good at crocheting by just looking at something, then I guess you could use this to make some vintage collars and sleeves in a crochet sweater, but there are no crochet patterns in it. So I guess you could try to adapt for crochet if you're so inclined. So again, this book has no patterns, so if you're expecting patterns, this is not for you. And this book also assumes that you are a regular knitter, and know how to knit sweaters already and have a bunch of sweater patterns that you want to work with already. So if that is not you, then this book is not for you. But otherwise, it is full of some really useful information, and I thought I would share that. And I was actually on the Amazon site today, and they have it on Amazon.com on sale for $11 something. I can't remember the cents, but it was 11 something. And the regular cover price is $24.95, so that's a good deal if you're interested in something like that. So yeah, I think that's about the gist of the book. So I thought I would share because I said in my previous video that once I had read it, I would give a little review. So that is my review. If you have any questions, leave them below. Again, I will answer questions via private message because I still can't comment because I still have not made a Google Plus account and I really don't want to. But yeah, so if you have any questions, leave them down below and I will inbox you with any inquiries you have about the book. And I will leave the link to the Amazon listing down below in case anyone's interested in purchasing. And so yeah, that's this book. Hopefully I will see you guys again soon with some finished crochet items. I know I say that every time, but I'm hoping it'll be in the next few weeks. Until then, I hope everyone's having a good summer and happy crafting.